St. Clair's ordination to the gospel ministry. And so we have an opportunity to talk about 50 years of pastoral ministry. And I want to begin with one because part of your ministry was with the Banner of Truth and producing really wonderful books for pastors and Christians. And so one person asked the question, Ryan Matherly asked, if there was one pastor's biography to read for a young preacher or pastor, what would it be?
Well, you know, they should read the Lloyd Jones biography.
Which one?
Well, they can read the 2-volume edition, or they can read the 1-volume edition. There's material in the 1-volume edition which came out later that isn't in the 2-volume edition. But by process of elimination, there's material in the 2-volume edition that isn't in the 1-volume edition. So they could read all 3 volumes.
And it's always better to read it too.
I think too that more recently they published the biography of the father of William Chalmers Burns, and he had a much more normal, ordinary, settled pastoral ministry that in many ways probably connects more to the experience of most pastors. That would be, I mean, I know it's Scottish, but it would be very helpful.
Now, you knew Dr. Lloyd Jones?
Well,
yeah, you tell me.
I did know him. I mean, I didn't know him the way I know you, but he, in 1975, I was a minister on the most northerly island in the United Kingdom. Had fairly deliberately gone there, and out of the blue he wrote to me in 1975. I have lost this letter several times, and I found it again, so it's on my cell phone now. I was saying to Alistair earlier on, actually, he was a doctor, and that meant in Britain that his writing wasn't very good. And I could read 1 or 2 statements, and I turned the letter over, and I couldn't really read the signature, and I honestly thought I had got a letter from a crank. And then there was another letter in the same mail, and I kind of made a connection from the second letter to Dr. Lloyd Jones' letter. And I mean, I could not have been further away from him and still been in the United Kingdom. And I guess I was 27 at the time. And that was a real indication to me. I don't suppose so much at the time, but later on I realized what an interest and concern he had for the ministry of the gospel in the future and beyond his own life. And you know, Alistair and I could spend the rest of this session telling Dr. Lloyd Jones stories.
What's your favorite Dr. Lloyd Jones story, Alistair?
Well, I wasn't present for this one, but my doctor in Yorkshire, a fellow called Kingsley Reid, he has a brother called Stuart Reid, and Stuart Reid was a veterinary doctor, but went into the ministry, and he was also a great mimic. And Lloyd Jones was preaching in Bradford and was given hospitality in the home of the doctor, Kingsley. And Kingsley had his brother up from London, and he was present that evening. And as the evening went on, as Kingsley got a little bolder, and he eventually said, you know, doctor, my brother here, Stuart, he's very good at mimicking you. And the doctor said, I don't know if I want to see that. He said, oh no, you'll love it, you'll love it. And so he was able to, you know, he knew some of his sermons, and he was able to do it, and apparently did a wonderful way. And that Lloyd Jones laughed uproariously. He thought it was terrific. The other thing I say about Lloyd Jones, anecdotally, is when I met with his daughter in Cambridge some years ago after Clemens had imploded, and we were talking about different things, but I said, what was he like on Sunday night when he came home? And she said he liked to read, and he liked to read something that was easy to read, and he would like me often just to sit on his lap while he read. He was very warm, he was very tired, and very compassionate. If you get the second, the 2-volume thing, you need to do what Ian Murray says in the introduction, and that is, he says, read the appendices to this before you read the second volume. And it is quite remarkable because what you have at the back there are his letters to his wife. And he's just gone on board the ship to go to America or something like that, and he writes, you know, Dear Bethan, I feel as though, you know, I wish tonight was the night that we were reunited, that I could sit and look into the eyes of the girls and talk with you. You got this amazing tenderness, you know, that on the front of that book that I mentioned, What is an Evangelical? I mean, when I gave that to my elders years ago, because the picture is very austere, and I laid it out for them at the place, and they all came into the elders meeting and picked it up and said, that's an evangelical. Yeah. But he was tender, wasn't he?
I think I realized also just through my earliest contacts with him, or his earliest contact with me, that he was partly reaching out to me and he was partly testing me. You know, I've often thought about the feeding of miracle in John's Gospel. How Jesus says, okay, you know, you need to feed these people. But he knew what he was going to do all along, and he was just testing them.
Yeah.
And I think I had a series of tests which were kind of interesting. The first was the letter.
Yeah.
The second context, the letter, he was asking me to do something because of a pressure on his spirit. And I declined, but I was like 1,000 miles away. The next time was probably about 18 months later, and he phoned me on a Saturday night. And we just had 2 boys then, I think they were 5 and 4. They were down at the far end of the room. Dorothy was making kind of boys' tea of bacon and egg and sausage and chips and all the rest of it. And the phone suddenly rang. And I heard this one, Madeline Lloyd Jones calling in from London. And I'm,
Yeah.
Dr. Lloyd Jones. So he asked me to do something. And then he said, I'll come back for your answer on Monday evening. So that was a miserable weekend, because I knew I was going to say no to him again. And then the third time, I was asked to go and speak at a conference in Wales, a ministers' conference, and I naively accepted the invitation, not realizing that he was behind the invitation, and he was the other main speaker, and he would be sitting right there in front of me.
No pressure.
Which was, I think, when I learned that I needed to preach before the face of God and not before the face of Dr. Lloyd Jones.
Now you know what I feel like when you're sitting there.
It was
Exactly the same feeling.
Okay.
But he was like that to us, wasn't he,
Yes.
Alistair? Yeah. Not somebody we really knew,
No.
but he was just one of those figures that provided a point of reference, a kind of lighthouse, a stabilizing influence. And we lived in a day, we're still alive in a day, but we grew up. I mean, he has always looked like this, and I've always looked like this, but they're not all that many years apart, and we grew up in an era when there just were people like that who influenced us, not necessarily because we knew them well, but because they took an interest in us and invested themselves in us.
I met him only once when he came to a Glasgow Evangelistic Society meeting in the tent hall, and Lloyd Jones hated choirs. He could not stand them, and he didn't like drafts. He didn't like if it was cold, like if he was up here. And so he came onto the platform wearing an overcoat. He had this overcoat on, And what made it even worse, there was a guy called Fitzpatrick who had a moment or two of leadership. He proceeded to arrive looking like Rod Stewart. He had a Royal Stewart suit on and proceeded to introduce Lloyd Jones like he was one of Lloyd Jones's great friends. And it was a mystery to me that he managed to pull that off. He took his coat off and came up very slowly, and the blooming choir had been singing. I knew that had really upset him horribly. But he still managed. Then I met him afterwards. He had a black hat on, and he had neck gloves. Black neck gloves, like I don't know what he was doing, but he shook hands with the gloves. He said, "It's so pleased to meet you." I only had one letter from him, which was declining an invitation.
So, one of these nights in this place, the Tent Hall, which was the largest auditorium in Glasgow, he was supposed to be coming, and he was ill, and it was Alec Murdoch who organised the thing.
Yeah.
Interestingly, a man he went on holiday with, and this man who went on holiday with him, told me that the day he discovered dispensationalist theology was like a new conversion to him. And just an interesting illustration of what Alistair was saying. He was rigorous in his doctrine, but he was very Catholic in his spirit. So he was sick, and he told this man, "Tell Sinclair Ferguson to stand in for me." So, I was still in my 20s.
Were you at Tron then?
No, I wasn't. I was in Dunfermline at the time. And, maybe 1,500 people that place would hold. And all the kind of evangelical notables were all arrayed on the platform. And you could see people looking along the platform and whispering, "Which one is Dr. Lloyd Jones?" And then the chairman gets up and he says, "We're really sorry that Dr. Lloyd Jones isn't here tonight, but we're absolutely delighted that Sinclair Ferguson is here tonight." And I thought, you and nobody else. It was one of my darker experiences.
Alistair, HB was asking you about your notes and what you do in terms of notes for preaching. And this question is for my friend Dan Phillips, who is a pastor in Houston, Texas. He asks, "Sinclair, do you preach from a memorized outline, or from notes, or from headings, or half notes, or something else? Because you seldom seem to look at anything when you're preaching."
That's just bad eyesight. Well, now at my advanced age, I always have something with me, but I am not a native speaker. It's not my natural mode of communication. I was educated to write to my teachers, not to speak. I've always found speech much more difficult. I'm okay when I'm with friends, but I could rehearse 20 times the beginning of a conversation before I would begin it with somebody. So, I've all kinds of psychological problems. And so I've never been able to preach from a manuscript. And so I've never worked with anything except for funeral addresses, which I started to manuscript, partly to keep myself within bounds, and also because it was in days before people would even dream of recording that, and somebody would say, I wish I could have taken in more that you said. And I could say to them, "Well, let me give you a copy." It's just the way I'm wired, and also because of the way my brain works, so that until it collapses, if I've gone down the road before, if I've driven down the road of my exposition, ordinarily I'm able to get down the road again. I may see new flowers on the way. But what I find is I'm editing as I go along. I'm usually chucking things out as I go along. So, it's just my own, the way I've learned to function best myself.
Lisa LaGeorge asks, "How has God encouraged you through his people over the years?"
Oh, totally. First of all, I owe my conversion, I believe, to a small group of people in the church that I was sent to as a 9-year-old boy, who prayed for me, and in very gracious ways encouraged me to read the scriptures, to hear the message of the gospel. To people, I'm sure Alistair experiences this a lot. People, you know, I've known in the past will say to me when I meet them, I still pray for you every day. The encouragement of people to, I had an almost immediate experience of I'm being called to the ministry. It was kind of unusual event. Somebody asked a friend of mine, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to be a minister. And it was just like everything was clear to me. That was all I knew. But I don't think I would have been able to proceed without the tremendous encouragement of others. And especially one or two ministers, obviously. Especially one minister or two.
A few months ago, Charlie Wingard, who teaches at RTS Jackson, has been in the ministry for many decades, was asked by somebody, if you had a do-over, you know, is there anything that you would go back and change? And he immediately responded by saying, well, you know, we don't have do-overs. And then he said, but if I could go back, I would be more gentle in my ministry. Well, here's a question that comes. If you could go back and talk to yourself in your 20s and change one thing, what would it be?
Change one thing. Do you know, this comes out of experience of, you know, of preaching around when I was in seminary or speaking at conferences, that, you know, I would never go away from a conference without feeling if I knew the scriptures better, I would have been more useful. Not just in terms of, you know, have I read through the scriptures, do I understand the doctrine, but in that kind of old Puritan sense of, do I understand well enough how these scriptures work into people's lives and all their diverse situations. And although, you know, I have studied the scriptures, I think I would urge upon myself to study them more. I'm not sure that's the only thing I would say, but that's certainly one of the things I would say. I think another thing I would say, although in my early 20s, I wouldn't have known what to do about this, would be to love people better, spend more time with older saints, and with the little people.
Michael Wilburn asks, between patience and decisiveness, which has been more determinative in your 50 years of ministry?
Probably patience. What do you think?
I don't know, I'm just soaking it all up here, you know.
Yeah. Do you know, a big text for me really has been Paul saying to Timothy, you know, careful teaching and great patience, in 2 Timothy 4. That has struck me at the beginning of ministry. So I think so.
Alistair, how about you?
I was just looking for a quote here by Ian Murray, who talks about young men in looking at older men and wherever they've ended up, they're tempted to believe that they can, with one giant step, get to the place that those men have reached over a long series of sideways steps and onward steps and so on. And Jim Boyce, he would always say, you know, be careful when you're young. You tend to overestimate what you can accomplish in a year, and you underestimate what can be accomplished in 5. There's such a strange thing in the psyche of time as well. I mean, when you're at the stage, you know, every progressive decade that catches you up, it changes. There's less runway in front of you, and so you can't make plans that you can allow yourself the luxury of saying, well, this will eventually, you know, hopefully, you know, you got to be far more existential in what you're doing. And I think patience, you have patience with people rather than patience with myself. I'm an impatient person. I mean, when I left the church to come to America, the chairman of the board in his farewell speech said, and so Alistair came to us as a young man in a hurry, and he leaves us as a young man in a hurry. And I said, okay. I said, thank you for the encouragement, but I sat and listened to that, and I thought, well, you know, the fact is I am in a hurry. I am. And hopefully I'm in a hurry for the right things, but when you're in a hurry like that yourself, you tend to be impatient with people who don't see what it is you're saying, who don't understand why you're trying to do what you're doing, and so that works against you. I think the one thing I would say is, I regret that it took me so long to realize that you don't drive your people from behind, you must lead them from the front. And somewhere along the line I realized how hortatory my ministry was. Come on, you can do, come on. And I don't know who spoke to me or what happened, but I had like a denouement, you know, I had a moment where I said, oh, I gotta cut this out. And suddenly then it changed and helped me immensely. And obviously, you know, because a congregation that has put up with you, in my case for almost 39 years now, is going to be a long-suffering congregation. But that's the beauty of it as well, because there's no pressure in preaching to my congregation beyond the normal pressure. It's not like coming here and doing this, because my people, I can't impress them or even disappoint them. I can disappoint them by letting them down, but you know, because they know there's another one coming in the evening. They can discount the highs and the lows, and that's why I love pastoral ministry in that respect, because it keeps you humble, it keeps you honest, it keeps you studying, it keeps you fresh, because your people know what you said last week, and you better not be saying the same thing again.
Eric Landry, who's a pastor in Austin, Texas, and who edited Modern Reformation magazine for a number of years, asked this question: what lessons did you learn from your biggest mistake or failure?
I can tell you one while you're thinking, because you'll come up with something good, right? Talking about impatience as well. So, I'm in an elders meeting, a series of elders meetings. There's a gentleman in the meeting who, from one meeting to the next meeting, he's got an entirely different view on whatever we was talking about. And I suddenly realized he talks to his wife, and his wife influences him, and then he comes in here and does the thing. And so in a moment of something, I said to him, hey, I've got an idea. Why don't you quit coming to these meetings and just send your wife? I did, I said that to him. I said, because it's pretty obvious now that there's a standard pattern here, and I knew his wife, she was a very pushy lady, and so that went over like a lead balloon. It was like electricity went all around the room, you know. And someone else tries to pick the ball up, you know. They said, "Well, let's look at the scriptures or something." You know? And so I went home. I wasn't proud of myself, but I wasn't. You know, I'm a bad person, and so. One of the elders was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. He was a Texan. And the following morning, on the phone, I get this call. Nels? Yeah. This is Bill. Hi, Bill. What you did last night was dreadful. He said, you know, even if there was a modicum of truth in what you said, You said it in the wrong way. You said it at the wrong time. And you should never do that in front of a group of people. If you got something to say it that way. I'm holding the phone, I'm thinking, shut up, you know, in a very Christian way, right? So he says, here's what you're going to do. He didn't ask. He says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to phone him. You're going to apologize to him. And you're going to phone me up when you've done it. I put the phone down. That was a crisis moment. Because he's the same guy who told me on another occasion. This same guy said, you know, I can do what you do. I said, what is it I do? He said, you stand behind a box and you talk. I said, do you really think that is what I do? He said, yeah, I do. So he wasn't exactly, you know, Melanchthon speaking to. Yeah. So I wanted to tell him to go and fly a kite. But I didn't, or go and fly a plane, but I didn't. I phoned the guy up and I told him exactly that. I said, I sinned my soul, I offended you, I did the whole thing. I did what the guy told me to do. And I phoned him up and I told him I did it. And he said, that's good. We'll go on from there. Well, that was a very important thing that happened to me because I have a lot of that in me. And sometimes when I feel myself about to go again, I go, no, wait a minute, that's going to be, he'll phone me up.
I think Alistair's sins can count double for mine.
He's having a hard time finding something. It's like he said, did you ever do anything when you were naughty? You know, he's like, yeah, I once spat on the pavement.
Daniel Kurtz.
Oh, you got out of that one.
Yeah. You did. You got out of that one. I'm going to go on to the next one. Daniel Kurtz asks, how have you maintained accountability? You've traveled a lot in ministry. You've been in a very prominent position as a theologian and as an author in the public eye. How have you maintained accountability?
Marriage, children, and the best of friends. And the Word of God, that you're constantly in it. You know, I think sometimes ministers can overdo their vulnerability to sin because they're ministers. I recognize that Satan is going to attack those who are leading in the church and serving in the church. On the other hand, you know, there's nobody else in my congregation apart from the other pastors who could study the scriptures hours every week. And so I think we should never make the fact that we are ministers a kind of excuse for so we're especially vulnerable. I don't know about Alistair. We have never been, like Alistair and I are obviously very long-time friends, and we have other long-time friends, and we're not in an accountability group, which sometimes I think can be more of a formal reality than an organic reality. And I would say, you know, one of the great blessings of our lives is these organic relationships we've had with other brothers whose very lives and ministries stimulate us to be faithful, stimulate us to godliness. Because, you know, I think one of the great things about our friendships is that we see graces in our friends that we know are not so present in us, and that draws us out to seek that. And, you know, I think that those have been the big helps to me.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, because that would be my answer right down the line, and the same thing with the friendships. You know, in my study, you know, you're there, Alec Mattia is there, Eric Alexander is there, Dick Lucas is there, John Stott is there, and they're all watching me. And in the sense that every so often when I say, I think I'll just stop studying, and I look over on the right-hand side and there's a picture taken in Birmingham, Alabama of Alec Mattia in somebody's house, and he's got a cardigan on, and he's just working on whatever he's working on. And I say, oh, well, maybe I'll stay another hour. And I'll tell you one other thing as well. When I watch the guys that have collapsed, even the ones in accountability groups, it's because they are the unhappy recipients of adulation, not affection. My congregation loves me even though I am who I am. They do not adulate me. My wife loves me. No adulation. Adulation will kill you because you start to smell that stuff. And the day you start believing that, you're on your way. And that's where there's something about, in the providence of God, all these factors feed in, don't they, to who we are and what we are. But I mean, especially in America, I hope nobody was offended by my thing about the presents and everything. But I mean, when I think about stuff like
Snickers.
well, the reason I said Snickers was because I wanted a Snickers bar from a fellow in there, and I went to get it afterwards, and he'd eaten it himself. But I'm done with that. That's fine. Yeah.
You know, I think another thing has been friendships with our elders.
Yes.
And the building up of the sense, which to me is very central in the New Testament, but in essence the church is the family, and that we have family relationships with one another.
Right.
Okay, this question's a little cheeky, but it might be fun. I'll ask it to both of you. Chuck Murphy asks, what book have you read that afterwards you would tell others, don't waste your time?
Don't say one of my
I know the answer to this. So we're at a conference somewhere in the United States, and he says, Sinclair, I've just got this copy of what I think is your best book. And we had a mutual friend who was the general manager of the Banner of Truth Trust, and had sneaked him this book. So I go along to his room to see what Alistair thinks is my best book, and he's got the printer's dummy. So the covers are on the book, but all of the pages are blank. That's the book.
Don't waste your time.
Don't waste your time. Too many. This isn't answering the question, but it often crosses my mind, just because of the amount of preaching you can hear, or watch on whatever these days. One thing I think I noticed among younger men with whom I was associated was that they would read the books that the men they admired were quoting. And I used to say to them, I'm sounding like an old man now, but I used to say to them, those are not the books that made that man's ministry. What you need to find is the books that he was reading when he was your age, because those are the books that made his ministry. And you don't get the root built by just reading what is the flowers, at the end of 30 years of ministry. And I think that's a very important issue. And both Alistair and I think we're privileged to know men. I remember when I was a student, one day I was with Eric Alexander, and he took me round his library and said, buy it, forget about it, sell your shirt to get it. Every single book in his library. To a teenager or 20 or whatever I was. That was a tremendous start through the maze of literature that has become available to us since the 1960s.
You look like you have a thought brewing.
Well, no, all I was going to say was I don't know what the answer to that would be, but I'm trying to encourage younger men to read far more diversely than they do. Part of the ability, I mean, you learn to speak by reading, and the kind of literature that you read gives you syntax, it gives you forms of expression, and as I listen to some guy speaking, not that I'm suggesting I've managed this, but it seems pretty clear to me that they don't really read very much. They're not enriched by it. They're not reading for the pure, unadorned joy of the experience. So, for example, you know, I read biography all the time, but I read years ago. I read Hitch 22, you know, because Christopher Hitchens was my favorite atheist, and you know, when you read that guy, it's amazing. For example, you know, talking about friendship, this is in the book. After he's been diagnosed with cancer and he knows that there's no way back, my chief consolation in this year of living dyingly has been the presence of friends. For me to remember friendship is to recall those conversations that it seemed a sin to break off, the ones that made the sacrifice of the following day a trivial one. And then, you know, with his education, he says that was the way that Callimachus chose to remember his beloved Heraclitus. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept when I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. You know, and the pathos that is in that, but you know, because the sort of brazen, the way in which he presented himself, but you know, behind that big veneer, there's somebody made in the image of God that is in rebellion against God, you know, and he's fighting against the only answer. It just, yeah. So I just say, you know, read other stuff. Quit reading all these books out there on the bookshelf. Ben's my friend.
I just have the impression that, and I don't know whether it's in the educational system now, in the English-speaking world, that people are much more encouraged to talk and to speak, but they're not necessarily encouraged to read and to learn about words and how they work and how you speak well. And there's a huge difference. So, you know, often men will come to seminary believing they've been called into the ministry, and one of the signs is they do not find it difficult to speak. But then you discover they actually do find it difficult to speak well, because they don't have a vocabulary, they don't have the categories with which they can speak well, and which they can draw on while they're standing on their feet and preaching. And that's the importance of reading. He's a much better reader than I am, actually.
We've mentioned Eric Alexander several times. You served with Eric at the Trine. Alistair and I have also benefited from his ministry. Will there be a bio of Eric at some point? No? He won't let it happen.
I wouldn't think so. Actually, I was thinking about him today, you know. I was thinking that, you know, whoever, quotes, managed this last, you know, 10 or 15 years. It's an interesting thing, even the way that he finished in his ministry. You know, he finished very abruptly, finished without any kind of approbation or affirmation, didn't want anything. I understand the perspective of that, but you know, that denies to others who have loved you and benefited from you the opportunity, because there's a grace in receiving as well as in giving. And but he talked about getting a phone call. When he would phone me up, I would do the same thing, because he has that deep voice. And soon my wife would know if it was he who would phone me up, because my voice would go up about an octave. It's like, oh yes, Like, well, wait, let me try that again. Yes, it's Eric Alexander. Whoa. He was one of the slowest guys. He only needed about 15 minutes of material to preach for 45 minutes because of his pace. I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm saying about, we talk about ordered approach, and he could do like an. It's like, wow, that was good. I love that. Is this bad?
Well, let me tell you an Eric story. So, I was the assistant to a very famous Keswick preacher, and he belonged to the era when ministers would write cards to people, and he always signed them GBD. And he was very tolerant of me. And I mean, one of my happinesses lies in the fact that I actually preached his funeral sermon. So despite whatever differences there might have been theologically, you know, he loved me and cared for me. And he was doing a series on the last things in the church. And he came to the millennium. I had no idea what he believed about the millennium. Nobody in Scotland ever asked you what you believed about the millennium. And so he gave 3 views, and then he committed himself to one. And there was this lovely lady whom I knew he had helped quite a bit, and therefore I knew she would have had a lot of these cards signed GBD. And she came up to me, she said, "Sinclair, do you take his view?" And I'm thinking, the last thing you ever ask the boy is, do you share the view of his boss? So I'm trying to take the line of least resistance. But do you take his view? Eventually I thought, I better man up here. So I said, well, I take one of the other views. And she kind of went on and on about GBD. And so I said to her, this is like one of your errors in ministry. I said, mentioned her name, I said, you need to remember it's GBD and not GOD.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So.
That was worse than my.
Eric comes onto the phone the next week. And, usually it would be, hello Sinclair, it's Eric here. So I pick up the phone and I hear Eric's rich tone saying, I've just been hearing about your finest pastoral moment. And she'd gone and told my boss. And, he never mentioned it to me. I mean, I was a mess. I was 23 and a mess.
Change of subject. Wilson Shirley, a young preacher friend of mine, asked, is there one thing that you have done consistently over your years of preparation for preaching besides prayer? One thing that you've done consistently in your preparation for preaching?
I think a really big thing to me has been trying to discover the logic of the passage. And I think that may be the thing that I work most on and have. And I think that began to happen because I realized I was wired in a certain way. The one thing that William Still ever said to me by way of caution was, you will need to be careful about your relentlessness. And I think I realized I needed to find a way of dealing with this, whatever it was. I mean, it didn't feel relentless to me, but obviously he picked this up, this relentlessness. It wasn't I don't think it was a guerrilla type thing. I think it was purely intellectual. And I think it was then I started thinking, if I can just get back to the basic logic of what is going on here, it will help me try to simplify what I'm doing. Now, I mean, I could never do what Alistair does.
And nor should you. It's painful doing it.
But I think given the way I am put together, this has been a big help to me to try and engage in a way that I'm able to pick the logic out in such a way that if I can unfold that logic, then new believers will be able to catch on to it, and mature believers should be able to feed on it. And I think that's that's just such an important thing in ministry that
it's not just important. It's fantastic. I mean, the proof of that is actually in your children's books, in the books that you've written for children. Frankly, the average young guy here ought to buy all your children's books. And the layout of the gospel and the progression of thought to be understood by a child's mind is the product of your ability to do what you've just identified as doing. And for lesser mortals, myself being specimen A, I don't see that the way you see it, and therefore I need you to see that, and so that you can help me, because it's a peculiar ability, and it has a lot to do just with your brain power. There, quite honestly, this guy has got like a size 18 brain. The average size of brain is, in my group, is around a 4.5. And so we need guys to be able to do that so that we can, get it and massage it a little bit and relay it in the way that God has gifted us. But those are, this is very, very...
It really is true. If you go to the Christian Focus table at the bookstore and get big book of questions and answers about God, big book of questions and answers about Jesus, any of the children's books are superb for exactly that.
You can preach for 6 months.
Absolutely.
Out of those books.
Absolutely.
Trust me, I've done it.
Michael Goff asked the question, you've seen many shifts in culture and in theology in the last 50 years of your ministry. What are 3 important issues in the global Protestant church that you think the next Sinclair Ferguson is going to have to address in the next 50 years?
I'm not capable of answering that. No.
Okay.
No. Can you answer that, Hans?
No, but I mean, the book you held up, Strange New World, by Carl.
Yeah.
That's his kind of thing. I think he, both in historical survey and in applying it immediately to the context and then looking down the road a wee bit, I think he does have answers to that.
I think the one thing I would say, Wigan, is as ministers, we can very easily get caught up with, if I can put it this way, here's a sect, let me read a book on the sect, and get the young people to read the book on the sect. And I think one of the great things about our Reformed tradition was they were much better at helping their people to understand what the gospel is and how the gospel works. And when they were equipped with that, then they were able to negotiate whatever came over the horizon. Because you live as long as we have, and you see, it almost seems that history is cyclical. It appears in varied manifestations. But if you've got the root of the matter, if you're really well instructed in Scripture, if you've got the Velcro strips of Scripture, then I think there is nothing you can't negotiate. You don't need to know everything about everything to know something about everything and something about everyone. And that's, for example, that's the glory, as it were, of Romans 1:18 to 32 when we're speaking to people who aren't Christians. We know they are suppressing the truth in their unrighteousness. They are denying it. And so whatever our capacity is, we're always looking for those loose threads that show that they cannot live consistently in God's world, denying God's existence. And that inconsistency will show, and so we begin to pull. And I think it's easy for us. I also think this is true for ministers. Now maybe I have a kind of distinctive view of what the ministry and the church is actually for. But it concerns me when ministers assume that they are the spokesman of Christians on every conceivable subject. Because you've congregations who have expertise that you don't. And, you know, I would see my main task as feeding and equipping them with biblical ways of thinking that will enable them to engage as, you know, I mean, you and I know people in the church in Colombia, very high level intellectual capacity, and I would never regard it as my task to teach, you know, it'd be teaching your granny to suck eggs. But what they appreciate is that they are more and more thinking through the lenses of Scripture about everything.
Alistair ended his message with a warning and an encouragement. Do you have a warning or an encouragement for us tonight as we close?
I think the warning is always Paul's warnings. On the one hand, there will be wolves that will arise, and we need to be able to discern their presence. And I think the other thing is, you know, when you've been in ministry and lived the Christian life the length of time we have, every 10 years you see another diversion to take a quicker way to fruitfulness. And there is no quick way to fruitfulness. It's always, you know, Alistair's conference is called The Basics. And it's always building up the strength of the basics and coming to know God. And in our preaching, not to be diverted from the pressures that are brought to bear upon us, that this isn't cutting the mustard. I think of Paul's words to Timothy. So people aren't going to listen to you preaching. What do? Well, you preach. You preach better. You seek the power of the Spirit in your preaching, because that is the instrument. And don't be diverted from that. And there are people who will divert you. And often, I remember being at a conference when a young man I knew when I was a young man stood up and he said, "Preaching isn't cutting the ice any longer." And I thought, I don't think I would have minded that sentence so much if you had said, "My preaching isn't cutting the ice." Because the true preaching of the Word of God in the power of the Spirit does cut the ice.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. Just a few announcements. Tomorrow morning's session will start at 9 a.m. sharp, and we'll begin with